Good morning, dolls, and welcome to Little Gretchen's workshop. So today we are going to finish the rooming house bathroom. Now that was that little area that split when I was squaring off the doorway. If you haven't seen that video, definitely check my playlist for the beginning of this particular series about the bathroom. So I filled it in. Now dolls, you definitely could have used wood putty to seal up this gap. But because this area doesn't need to be stained, the joint compound worked really great. And this is the kind I normally use. It's lightweight, it's really fine, and it doesn't have a lot of dust if you sand it. Now in this instance, I didn't sand it. I probably should have, but I didn't. And I looked around the room and noticed there were a couple areas that needed to be compounded as well. So I filled in those gaps. With any dollhouse, there's always the possibility of gaps, and you want to close that up because it doesn't look natural in your room setting. Now here I have embossed paper that I'm going to install for my ceiling of the bathroom. I love the texture because it's great for hiding imperfections in the ceiling, and it looks like those old-fashioned decorative ceilings old houses used to have. Now, I actually used the same pattern in my kitchen and painted it copper, but for the bathroom, I'm going to leave it white. It has sort of a pearl finish, and I really like that. So I'm doing a thin coat of Mod Podge to protect it during decorating. So here's the flooring I've chosen. It's called Victorian floor. It's a tile pattern. It's a really heavy cardstock paper, but it's really nice quality. It's flexible and it has like a shiny coat to it. And I think it'll look nice with the white ceiling and with the blue stripe wallpaper. So let's go ahead and get started. So I want to apologize ahead of time for the shaky camera and all the adjustments. I was trying to make it so you dolls could see what I was doing. I don't know if I did a very good job or not, so I do apologize. So here I am installing the embossed paper for the ceiling. So make sure you put plenty of glue or whatever adhesive you're using in the crevices so that you'll have good adhesion. Make sure you press it all the way in, especially in the corners. Now, when I do my wallpaper, I always do the easiest parts first. So I wanted to start with the back wall so that I'll work my way out of the room, if you know what I mean. So I'd already cut the piece to size, but I made it a little bit bigger so it would cover up those corners. I always do that to ensure that I don't have gapping or you don't see spaces in the corners of my room setting. So I added my glue, which is Mod Podge and tacky glue, really thin coat, and I was trying to work pretty quickly because my wallpaper is kind of inexpensive, so you can't touch it a lot, and I didn't want the adhesive to absorb too much where it would come through. So I lined it up in the corners and tried to touch it as little as possible. And I will show you a remedy for how to protect inexpensive papers after you've installed them. Now you have to be aware when you're using really inexpensive paper, it has a tendency to tear when it gets wet. You can't rub on it. You can't smooth it with a sponge. You can't rub it down with a credit card. Any of those things could possibly rub off the finish, tear it, or just damage it in some way, which will really end up making you have to use a whole nother piece. So be very careful when you're using inexpensive paper. Although this was a decent quality, it came in a bundle pack of several different patterns. It's very delicate. You can't work with it like you can wallpaper that has a coating or finish on it. So I went ahead to finish those corners and just added a little bit more of my adhesive mixture to make sure that flapped piece was flush. And I went on to complete that long wall, which I consider the other easy part. So I overlapped that corner piece, made sure the stripes lined up because that's something that your eye would pick up if it's not straight. So I went on to speed this part up a little bit because this was the more simple part of doing the wallpaper so we could get on to the part that was just a little bit more challenging. So again, easy parts first. So then I went on to do the portion above the doorway and that corner. So this corner, this side of the wall is a little bit more challenging because I have to cut around the door. I have to make sure the lines are straight and make sure everything lines up evenly because my paper is not long enough to cover the complete area in one piece. If you're fortunate enough to have paper that you don't have to cut and splice, that's always great. But many times that's not how it works out, dolls. So I did have to cut around that area where the door opening is and making sure I lined up the lines to the paper. I kept me a baby wipe nearby, but I can't touch the wallpaper with my hands being damp. So this portion of the video has been edited quite a bit because I had to allow for my hands to dry because any touching or rubbing of the paper with damp hands will cause the design to rub off. Now, although the paper is smooth and the lines are straight, my paper does have some little lumps in it. Some of them will shrink back, but the ones that don't, I'm not worried about it because this is an old rooming house, so it may have lumpy paper. And with regard to lining up the stripes, you would have to do that with real wallpaper anyway. So just take your time. Don't rush through this process because you want to be proud of what you created. So take your time, dolls. Now, after I scraped it a little bit, I probably should have sanded it, but I didn't. I felt like it was smooth enough for me to put the paper on and that the paper would camouflage where I filled in the gap. And I also have to put on door trim, so I thought it would be fine. So dolls, I want you to always realize when you're going around the doorways with your wallpaper, it's always going to require a little bit more patience. So that's why I advise to do the simpler parts first. But just take your time, make sure your print lines up. Now dolls, I find that doing stripes is easier than some other prints. Now you may have a different experience, but that's just my opinion. I really think prints are simpler to do. But I went ahead to complete adding the beautiful blue wallpaper. So now for the fun part. We're adding the beadboard. So I pulled out my beadboard pieces that I had created on a template. If you haven't seen that video, dolls, definitely check that out in my playlist. Now when I made my templates, I did make them a little bit longer than what I needed them to be. I prefer to have more than enough and then to be able to trim it than for my pieces to be short and I have to add on. So I fitted my first piece to the side and I used the door frame with the trim on to size it so that when I've completed the beadboard, adding my door trim will be a breeze. So after I got that portion installed, I put in the back piece, which I felt like would be the next simplest piece. And you definitely want to check for those corners, dolls. You don't want gaps in the corners of your beadboard. Those type of details really will throw your eye off and break the fantasy of the realism of your room setting. So always be conscious of making sure your corners don't have gaps. Now we're going to move on to the long wall. Now I want you dolls to notice that the wallpaper comes down a little bit further on the wall than the beadboard because I wanted to make sure that the beadboard was overlapping on top of the paper. And for me, that just ensures just a smooth finish, good adhesion, and just clean, really clean lines. So I laid the beadboard on that long wall and tried to press it in and make it as smooth as possible. But with all that smoothing, it still didn't close the gap. So dolls, I had to gently pull the beadboard away from the wall enough to create a slight buckle so that I could press that corner piece in and seal up that gap. So the glue, although it was drying, it's forgiving enough that it allowed me time to make that adjustment and close up the gap. I'm really pleased with how the rooming house dollhouse bathroom is looking. I love how these colors go together. I think the dolls are going to like their new bathroom. I do. So let's move on to the floor. So I added a generous amount of glue, and then I picked up my paper that I'd already previously cut and sized, and I bent it in a C shape toward the floor so that when it sealed, it would go under the bead board and kind of lock down. If you do it the other way, the flaps will flip up and it'll be really difficult to install your baseboards. So always keep that in mind, dolls. And even if it looks really, really smooth after you lay your paper down, you always, always, always want to put something heavy on it while it's drying to make sure that it dries flat and flush. Now, after I laid my floor in, dolls, I have to admit, I just stared at it for a while just to admire how it looked. And after the floor dried with books on top of it to keep it flat, I coated it with satin Mod Podge to seal in my work. This will protect the inexpensive paper from damage when I go forward to decorate using tacky wax or museum wax to stick things on the wall, pictures, mirrors, cabinets. It just protects your work from damage while you're decorating. And although this looks very, very pre-K, it looks like I've ruined all the hard work I've done. It's going to dry absolutely clear and the room is going to look beautiful. Now, I did actually come back over the blue paper with the matte Mod Podge because I didn't like the shininess of the satin on the wallpaper portion. But the satin looked really great on the wood and on the floor. So that's definitely something you need to consider beforehand, whether you want your wallpaper to be shiny or matte. But I think the satin works really well for the wood and the floor. So after I completed the whole bathroom with the satin Mod Podge, I allowed it to dry. And again, it looks really odd and lumpy, but when it dries, it's going to look great, dolls. Now, I did notice there was another buckle in my bead board. And I want you dolls to see these type of things so that if something like this happens, you won't panic. I used my blade to split the board where the buckle was. And it did cause the Mod Podge to kind of rumple up. But no worries, dolls. You'll be able to clean all that up after you do your repair. And then I just began to hold it and press it back in place. Now, the Mod Podge is going to wipe off and clean up really easily. The wallpaper won't damage because it's been sealed in by the Mod Podge. So, all done. Now, dolls, I didn't show you when I cut the baseboard, but this is when I created tension brackets to make sure that the baseboard dried flat up against the wall. I just braced it with spare pieces of other beadboard or crown molding scraps that I had. And now that they're dry, I'm going to remove all of the brackets. And there we are. The floor is flat. The beadboard is on. Some of the baseboards are on. And now I'm going to just check that area for the door to make sure everything is clear for when I put the trim in around the side. Now, I did find another remnant piece of baseboard that I could add to that corner. Now, this was a scrap piece. I wasn't very precise with my measuring, but it worked out, dolls, because I just needed a little piece for that small corner. And as long as it clears the wall and the door frame, it's going to be good because it'll be covered by the other part of the door frame. So I added glue and put a bracket there to make sure that it dried flush as well. And I added a little piece of tape at the bottom and wrapped it around the wall to keep it nice and tight around the door area. So while that's drying, I'm going to put the finishing piece at the top of the beadboard. Now, these are square wood sticks that I stained previously. They're the same width as the coffee stir sticks, so they're the perfect size to finish off the top of my beadboard and make it look finished and square. So here I am making my amazingly precise cut for that piece. And here I am again making my precise cut for the back piece of the top of the beadboard. Now, dolls, I always dry fit my pieces before I add the glue. Originally, I thought this was going to be too long, but it actually worked out good because it had a slight amount of tension on it, and it ended up fitting really, really well. Now, after looking at that piece, I notice I have gaps under my finishing piece, which I will need to fill in after I'm done. So I checked for the piece for the corner. So I needed to make it where it would butt up against the piece that I had laid in the back before I add the glue. And when I made sure that the size was right, I went ahead and glued them in. Now you can see a little bit better where I'm showing you I'm going to need to add wood putty. And I'm going to use the same technique as I used on the baseboards in the girls' room. But I won't even attempt that until the finishing piece is dry. So I added a small amount of tape just to keep it in place and made sure it dried flat. Now I was careful not to get the masking tape on the wallpaper because I don't want it pulling off my really nice finish that I added. Always be careful with your wallpaper after you've installed it when you're trying to do other things using any type of tape, because if it catches it and you go to remove the tape, it will destroy your paper. So here I'm just allowing you to see me add the rest of the finishing pieces to the top of the beadboard, just so you'll see what it looks like and what I did, and even some of the problems I ran into. It wasn't difficult. It was more tedious than difficult, but it actually really turned out very, very nice. Now, I did have a little problem here that I left so you all could see it. A part of my baseboard began to lift, so I created one of those little brackets to make sure it stayed flat while it dried. Now I've got my trusted wood putty to fill in those gaps below the finishing piece, and the technique is the same as what I used to finish the gaps in the nursery and in the girls' room. If you haven't seen that video, definitely check it out. I know it almost looks like we're in a boat, dolls, the way my camera is shaking. I do apologize, but I just wanted you to see what I did, how I added it just below the finishing piece. I packed it in with my fingers and scraped it with the little glue spreader. And then after it dried, I coated it with a couple coats of my cherry wood stain. And I did have to do more than one coat. I did have to wipe it. Be very careful when you're doing or using this technique so that you don't get the stain on the paper. Although the paper is sealed, you just don't want to be sloppy in the process. But I do want to show you what I did and how well it cleaned up. So here I was adding the stain to this portion of the beadboard and my brush dripped. Now you see that big glob of wood stain on the floor? Yeah, gotta get that up. And although I knew I needed to get it up, I didn't feel worried because I had sealed it with the Mod Podge. Had I not sealed it, yeah, it may have created a real problem on my floor. So always be mindful of things like that. But I wiped it up and you see there's no damage. So I continued to work all the way around the room just under that finishing piece to stain the wood putty I had added to fill in the gaps and allowed it to dry. Now I didn't show it here, but I did add a couple more layers of the stain just to ensure that the tones matched because I had stained the beadboard in multiple layers. Now here I'm just showing you I've added the crown molding. I didn't show it when I put it in, dolls, because it was just like when I added the beadboard. So I just wanted to show you here I didn't add the baseboard because I do need to place another order for baseboard and door frame. So that'll be forthcoming, but I'm not going to hold up the opening of the bathroom for the lack of one baseboard. We're going to go ahead and get this going. And I just want you to see I'm really pleased even with the lumps in the wallpaper because I think that is very authentic. I think that an old rooming house may have lumpy wallpaper. And look how nicely my door opens. Yeah, I'm really proud of this. So let's get the fixtures. So here's the bathtub, the toilet, and the sink. Looks like the dolls have already been in here trying to get things cleaned up. Looks like somebody was kind of careless carrying the bucket because there's a lot of water on the floor. But anytime you see Murphy's Oil Soap and Comet, the bathroom is definitely being cleaned. I also see that the dolls have brought in some of their first aid items and toiletry things. There's even 2 rolls of toilet paper on the back of the toilet tank. Now, dolls, if you've enjoyed this video today, definitely let me know in the comments. Also, like, share, and subscribe. And always look for me on Mondays and Wednesdays after 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I sure am enjoying making these videos for you dolls. Oops, it sounds like someone is coming. I may need to get out of here with the camera. Looking forward to seeing you dolls on the next episode of Little Gretchen's Workshop. Bye-bye now.